Everyone wants good lighting, right? Or cinematic lighting in your studio or on location somewhere. Now, what cinematic means, what cinematic lighting should look like, is different for everyone. But that doesn't matter actually, because look, I was going through some comments on older videos that I made on lighting and lighting setups, how to make lighting look more cinematic, and it seems like a lot of beginners struggle with the same thing. A few basic mechanisms and concepts, how camera settings and lighting interact with each other in mysterious ways. I mean, it's not that mysterious of course, but if you're a beginner, it might seem like sorcery sometimes. So anyway, a few basic things that you should know and learn before you start watching videos on how to position your lights to make it look more cinematic or whatever. Because lighting is not just about light. Wait, that's super confusing. You know what? I'm just gonna show you, because the more I talk about it, the more I'm not only confusing you, but also myself. And even if you're not a complete beginner, this could potentially be very useful. So yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna take my studio here as an example environment, and let's say you have a camera, one lens, and a few lights. And at the end of the video, I will also show you how it works if you have only one light in combination with natural light. And keep in mind that the result, or what my lighting looks like here now, is not important, because the goal is for you to be able to create whatever you want. And I'll try to keep it simple. And the first thing I want to do is decide how blurry I want the background. And you can change the amount of blur by adjusting the aperture on your camera. Well, on the lens actually. A low number means a lot of blur and a high number means less blur. And that's the only way to change the amount of blur in the background. I mean, technically, you could also go closer to the subject, because the distance to the subject also affects how blurry the background is. But then you're also changing the framing and the perspective and everything. So to keep it simple, we're just gonna talk about a camera in a fixed position, on a tripod for example, like here in my studio. Okay, so right now my aperture is set at 1.8. That's the lowest number it goes on this lens. So that means max amount of blur in the background. But now, let's say I find it too blurry. I want some more detail in the background. Well, then I have to increase the aperture. So let's do that. I'm gonna set it at 3.5. Higher number means less blur. Okay, but you see what happened now, right? Everything's too dark. I'm too dark, the background's too dark. But on the other hand, the background is also less blurry. And that's because I set the aperture to 3.5. And by increasing the aperture, I basically close down the hole in the lens through which the light hits the sensor. And a smaller hole means that less light is hitting the sensor, so it's underexposed now. But what if I really like this amount of blur in the background? What are my options? Well, because I can't use aperture to increase the exposure again, I could increase the ISO value. Let's try that. Okay, there we go. It's at 5000 now, and you can see it, the exposure is basically the same as before again, because increasing the ISO makes the sensor more sensitive. So with a higher value, you can basically get the same exposure with less amount of light. But increasing the ISO will also increase the noise in your image. How much? Well, that depends on your camera. On some cameras, 3200 will still look okay, but on other cameras, it won't. And ideally, for example, if you're shooting a movie in different locations, different scenes with different lighting conditions, well, you don't want to keep changing the ISO value all the time, because then every shot in your movie will look different when it comes to noise. I mean, sometimes you don't have a choice, of course, and you have to increase the ISO, but ideally you want it to look somewhat consistent, right? So let's bring back down the ISO. Okay, we're back at 1600. So what other options do I have? Shutter speed maybe? Well, in photography, sure, increase the shutter speed to lower the exposure, or lower the shutter speed to increase the exposure. In a lot of cases, in photography, that's possible. But in videography, that's something you don't want to do, because it will completely mess up your video. Let me just show you. I'll lower the shutter speed. And the exposure looks okay again, but look at the motion blur. How weird is that? That's not what you want, right? And also, the other way around, increasing the shutter speed is usually not a good idea. Ideally, you want to set your frame rate to whatever you want. In my case, it's 24 FPS, and then double the shutter speed. So for me, that's 1/50th of a second. And then never touch it again, unless you want slow motion. Okay, let's increase the shutter speed again because this looks weird. Okay, so shutter speed not an option, aperture not an option, ISO ideally also not. So there's only one option, and that's lighting. I have my key light here, and that basically means that it's my main light, and I'm underexposed, so I'm simply gonna increase the output of my key light. Let's do that right now. Not sure at how much I have to set it. Maybe a little bit more even. Yeah, that looks okay, I think. Not perfect, but it's just to show you the idea. And so, yeah, I can control the exposure of my face, myself, with the output of my key light, without having to touch any camera settings. But what about the background now? So if you want to change the lighting in the background and, well, also the exposure of the background, you need lights there to light the background specifically. I have a few in the background, and of course you can position them however you want. And we're talking about light ratios here now. You know, maybe you want the background significantly darker than the foreground or the subject, or maybe just as bright. It doesn't matter now because you have full control. You have full control over every part of the lighting, but also exposure. And the key thing to understand is how every part of the puzzle, every light, every camera setting, in its turn will affect another part of the puzzle. But that also means that if you have enough lights, you can basically do whatever you want. Let me just change the background light here to show you. It's not that strong, so I can't go very bright, but I can go very dark. This is maximum, doesn't do a lot, but if I go darker, see what I mean? And so you can create any mood and any look you want because the same basic principles and mechanisms apply in movies as well as in your home studio. Camera settings, lighting settings, it's all connected. Change one thing and it will cause a chain reaction. That principle, that concept, I don't know how to call it, that's the secret to good lighting, to cinematic lighting, and basically to photography and videography in general. Okay, I'm gonna put everything back to how it was, how I like it, and then we'll talk more. It looks weird now, but I think this is how it was, right? Okay. So you have to decide what your priorities are, because look, for example, in my studio here, I always use ISO 1600 and aperture 1.8. Not necessarily because I like the background super blurry, I mean, I do like it, but it's also because when I open up the aperture all the way, so big hole, and I set the ISO to 1600, which is pretty high, well, then I don't need a lot of light to get the correct exposure. I can set my key light here at minimum output. And that's a lot more comfortable to record a long video. Because the light is not blinding me, it's not hurting my eyes. Before, when I increase the output, it's just not comfortable. I mean, for me it isn't. And also, when I set it to minimum output, it won't light up the whole room, so I have a bit more control over the background, for example. But if you, for example, find this too blurry, well, then you're gonna have to close down the aperture, increase the number. But that will lower the exposure, so you either have to increase the ISO also, but that might not look good, it might look too noisy. So the only other way then is to increase the output of your light, because you can basically get the same exposure, almost the same exposure with different settings combinations on your camera and your lights. But if you do that, then your light will be a lot stronger and it might not be as comfortable. Priorities. See how that works? See how everything, every setting, camera and lights, it's all connected. Sorcery. Okay, but that was an example in a studio environment where you have control over everything. But what if you only have one light and some natural light in the background that you can't really control? Let me show you. I'm gonna open up the curtain. I can control it, of course, here, but you know, the idea is that you can't control the natural light that's gonna come in from through the window. And I'll turn all the lights in the background off, or most of them. Damn. No. Okay, and this should make you understand everything even deeper, if you know what I mean. I'm starting to realize that it's a lot. And it's a long video also. I hope there's no steam coming out of your ears yet. Okay, anyway, we'll power through, yeah? So, because you only have one light and some natural lights, your options are, of course, limited. So what you have to understand now is that with your camera settings, you're gonna control the exposure of the background, the environment. So I can make the background brighter or darker by changing the aperture or the ISO. And you can't be too picky about the look of your image now, because your options are limited. Depending on the lighting conditions, you might have to go for a very small aperture to get the exposure right. The exposure of the background, I mean. So you might have to choose between the exposure that you want or the amount of blur that you want in the background. And of course, you can also play around with the ISO settings, but that will depend on how good your camera is in low light. So in this case, you use the camera settings to set the exposure for the background, the environment, and you use the light, the key light, to set the exposure for the subject. I can't go any lower now, so, you know, But I can make the background very dark and then increase the output of the key lights. Let me just show you so that you have an idea of, how it works. You should already have an idea after this whole video, but yeah. Okay, so very dark background. I increased the aperture number to 5. Maybe it's too much even, but okay. And now I'll increase the output of the key light to set the exposure for my face and everything. The foreground. Not sure how much it has to be. This is still too dark. So maybe 5 is way too much. Maybe I can go even higher. I'm at 100% now. Okay, the exposure of my face looks okay, but it's like I'm next to the sun. This is not how I want to record videos. And also, even though you can get a similar exposure with different settings, a super high output on your key light, it will feel different. Because, you know, the light lights up the whole room, and because the output is so strong, your subject will squint his or her eyes. And yeah, even though the exposure might look the same, it won't feel the same. Always remember that. Okay, let's put everything back to how it was. And this is also how you can avoid blown out highlights, for example, if your subject is in front of a window or a strong light source. Without lights, this might be the result. And a lot of times there's no way to fix it unless you have one light or a reflector. Because then you can first set the exposure for the background, the outside where the light is strong, and then light the subject with the light because it will probably be too dark. So you control the exposure of the subject with the light. And this is, in my opinion, the hardest part of cinematic lighting and good lighting in general. When you have a natural light source, but it's not strong enough, or it's too strong, so it will blow out parts of your image. Because then you have to add an artificial light source, but the difficult part then is to make it look like you're not using an artificial light source, because you want it to look like natural lighting, a naturally lit scene, or a scene that has just a few table lamps, for example, or a candle. A scene like that in a movie is never lit with just that candle, because it's not enough. That's why lighting in movies is so important. And most people don't realize that a naturally lit scene is never naturally lit. Or never say never, of course, but a lot of times. Behind the camera or outside of the frame, there's usually some lights or reflectors. But the thing is, if people don't realize that it's there, that means that the people who do the lighting are doing a great job. Wow, that was a long video. I really hope it helps. But yeah, I'm telling you, no matter what lighting you want, understanding these mechanisms and concepts is key. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.